Hello and welcome to Datum. This is season 3 and episode number 2. I hope you enjoyed the last episode. Ravi, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, that last episode was good fun. I think it was good. Nice recap 2019 because we actually got through a lot last year.
Yeah, we did. But this episode, we're joined by our very first guest.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. How you doing?
I'm well. Yeah.
Whereabouts in the world are you?
I'm currently in, I was about to say sunny San Diego. I'm currently in dark morning San Diego. And I'm out here to do some consultancy at the moment, and so I've got up at 6ish to speak with you guys. So it's really
dedication.
I
love it.
I think this reminds me of when it was snowing in the UK. Do you remember that? And we did like a couple of podcasts when I was over in New Jersey for a couple of weeks, and that was again. I think I did similar 6 or 7 a.m. start to get a podcast in. So thank you,
absolutely,
getting up early for us.
But it's a true dedication for our first podcast guest. I guess for context, we actually work with Gwilym, so we all work at the Information Lab. But Gwilym's abroad, and we decided to kind of use this opportunity to get him on board to talk about our topic today, which is data ethics. Ravi, what do you think about data ethics?
Yeah, data ethics is a fun one, right? Because it's almost like it's one of those things where when you onboarded at a company, it's one of those videos you have to watch. There's a sort of week long of induction and all these things, and the sort of stuff where it's about data security, data ethics starts with you, and like the leaflet you get is like has a mirror on it, and it's sort of to remind you that it's everyone's responsibility. But I think it's also I think we're going to discuss this a lot more in this episode, but it's something that is often ignored or sort of almost passed off to someone. It's like, I'm not as important for this. And Gwilym actually teaches this at the data school as a sort of module that we do, and I think for everyone that's gone through that process, and it always encourages different conversations. I think you'll agree with that, Gwilym?
Yeah, for sure. So I spent about I have like a 3-hour session with the DS where I talk about data security and data ethics. I like how we were talking about the training videos at different companies, because those are always it's almost like they've designed it to be as boring or as ridiculous as possible, which has the counterintuitive effect of making people care less about it.
Exactly.
So you sit through these really long videos about how you should never give anybody your password, and you think, well, obviously, but then the way it's hammered home makes you less likely to really take it seriously.
Exactly.
But funnily enough, that one actually has happened to me before. I once had I was once working with someone who it was a transatlantic project. I was in the UK, they were in the States, working for an American client, and I was their Tableau guy based in London. And it was this long project with a lot of deadlines, and it was quite stressful. And this the lady who was on point for the project was messaging me to say, "Hey, I need access to this dashboard, this work in progress thing you've got. Where is it?" So I sent her a link to the Tableau server, and she said, "Great. What credentials can I use?" Well, if you're not registered on Tableau server, what you're going to have to do is talk to the IT guy to set up on site.
Right.
And then she says, "Oh, can I borrow your credentials? I'll log out after download." And I thought,
after download, that's brilliant.
So and this was all over Skype for Business as well, right? So I have no idea if this is even her. I don't know if this is someone sitting behind a laptop and typing away. So my reply was, "Sorry, I don't know if this is a test or for real, but sharing credentials is a huge security risk. Delaying a client project by a few hours is not worth that risk." Because I was a good boy. I sat through all the videos. And she comes back like, "No, I still really need sign in. I'm going to CC your boss and your boss's boss. I will take the risk." It's my password. It's not your risk to take. But yeah, so we chat about all this kind of stuff at the data school as well, because it's one thing to sit through the videos and not take them seriously. It's another thing to chat about real times where risks do occur.
Yeah, so it was interesting with the passwords thing, because it's everyone has their own weird inverted commas. I'm doing the quote marks here. Secure way of doing things. I've seen people have the draft email they keep with all their logins and credentials they can copy and paste, or an insecure notepad. And I always find about those.
I've seen so many Google Sheets full of people's passwords or hints of passwords.
Right, exactly. And it's stuff like this, and it makes you wonder, like, you do all these data ethics and data security classes when you were inducted, or all of these times when you're not really paying attention. But I wonder how many companies have actually implemented something that does do a test. Like, imagine if that was a test with the person you're working with. or even just a recap, right? Like as in a refresher, everyone has to go through, and you're regularly checked in on these things.
Right.
I think what we're going to talk about a lot here is why is it important in data, tech, and analytics in the sphere we work in, and also a bit about the origin, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So why don't we dive into that, sort of sticking to the old what so what format. What is data ethics? I guess I'll open up that discussion first to maybe Gwilym or Ravi. Go for it.
So it's one of these things where I think it's quite difficult to define in a nice snappy sentence.
Right.
The way I see it, data ethics is, okay, so you're doing stuff technically with the data and you're doing your job, but can you step back and think about it for a moment, please? That's what I think of as ethics. Like, okay, I can see what you're doing from a business standpoint, but what are you actually doing? You know, what's the effect? What could potentially go wrong? What are you what are you doing without realizing? Who are you affecting? Stop looking at the numbers. What's the processes? What's the people? And I'm kind of paraphrasing Georgia Loopy here.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's sort of a lot about the value judgments, right? The softer side, the softer implications that are derived or maybe even implied from the way you go about handling data, right?
Yeah.
If I was to try and compress it into a phrase, that doesn't cover half of it, but yeah, it's about the closest I can get.
I think a lot of this comes. There's a lot of blurred lines here, right? Like between security, ethics, and privacy. I think we talked when we had the data and privacy episode. We talked a bit more about whether it's right to have the GDPR regulations and PID data and all these different things. But then it's like, well, if you're trying to use data to improve lives, do you not need some level of, demographic data? And that's where we start getting to that ethical point, right? At what point do you stop looking at a row as a row of data and start thinking of the person behind it? And what is the intent? I think the intention is really important here.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost as if there's multiple strands. So like it says data ethics, you'd think it's only focusing on ethics, but actually there's an underlying level of sort of law or legislation, whatever you want to call it, that sort of, this is how you handle data, GDPR being a good example. Then there is the there's a practice. So, people like you and me, we all have agreed ways of handling data and understanding what's the best, most efficient way of doing that, and then applying that to the first rule, which is law. And then there's a third level, which is, okay, you're doing the first two fine, but there's still another aspect, which is you might be doing the first two, but still not actually considering ethics in itself, right? And it sort of has an implied relationship between those three things.
Yeah, for sure. So, Gwilym, how do you relate this back to sort of the business analytics side or the sort of day-to-day usage of, we talked a bit about like, well, it's everyone's responsibility. How does that sort of factor in when you're speaking about data ethics?
So I think that this is one of the most crucial points about data ethics, and I see it as a bit like climate change in the way that people approach it. So everyone kind of appreciates that climate change is a massive problem, but on the individual level, you can people see it as like, well, I'm trying and I cycle to work, but so I don't have a car, and that's the best I'm doing. But I know that it's also relatively like it's a drop in the ocean. What change can I really make? I'm not the head of BP. I'm not the head of Shell. I can make some actions, but I can take some actions, but is it going to do anything? And data ethics is kind of similar in that people think, when you read about data ethics or when you see it in the news, you see stuff like how, the YouTube algorithm may or may not radicalize people towards the far right, or how also the YouTube algorithm may or may not direct. There was a fascinating but terrifying story in the New York Times about 6 months ago. What was the headline? It was called, it was something like YouTube's digital playground is an open gate for pedophiles, something like that. And it was about how, the algorithm would pick up, it would identify people who watch like certain kinds of content, and it would realize that people who watch this kind of content also watch content with young girls in it or young children in it, and how the algorithm kind of facilitated that and would direct pedophiles to innocent videos that kids had uploaded of themselves, and it was horrific. But people see stuff like that as data ethics, which it is. But people see the big stuff and think, I'm not like someone who develops the YouTube algorithm. I'm a guy with a dashboard. So what is it like? My dashboard is this week's sales. Where's the data ethics in that? But it's something I make the point of is that when you hear about workers in Amazon warehouses like pissing in bottles because they in the middle of the warehouse they're like a mile away from the nearest toilet and they can't you can't go all the way to the loo and then all the way back to where you are without spending ages doing that and then losing time, etc. Sure, that's unpleasant, but somewhere at Amazon there is someone like us who has a dashboard of some like employees' time, and so someone with a dashboard is probably just reporting time on work and time off work for individual employees, and the way that they've set up that dashboard probably just doesn't account for stuff like going to the loo on a shift when you're a long way from a toilet. So and that's the mundane side, but that's how something that feels relatively mundane can actually lead to ethical and unethical situations.
Exactly, and even that example maybe has some implied bias in it, because if you're maybe a woman who's about to go through a pregnancy, you might need the loo more often. So a dashboard like that would also not take that side of the sort of conversation into account, and it can lead to sort of biases being kind of only amplified further than
exactly.
Otherwise would be.
So that reminds me of one of the best articles I read last year. It was in the Huffington Post. It was called something about I was a cable guy. It's by this woman called Lauren Huff, who's so she's a writer. She wrote something fantastic about how she wrote an article about how she was a cable technician in the States, and her job was to drive around various different places and fix people's cable. And her whole point, one of the things that comes through this essay, is how she was one of the only female employees, and when you're driving around suburban America or rural America, if she needed the toilet, she would have to drive way out of her way to get to the nearest convenience store. And even then, you don't necessarily want to go to the convenience store bathrooms because they're not safe. So there's this whole section there about how she's arguing with her boss for a pay rise because she's paid less than her male colleagues. And then her boss turns around and said, well, it's because of your numbers. You complete fewer jobs per day than your male colleagues, and it's performance-based. And there's this whole section where she's like, well, yes, that's true, but my male colleagues have like massive bottles, like massive empty Gatorade bottles that they fill with urine while driving. And I'm physically incapable of that. and
wow.
And so that to me is data ethics. So and that to me is somewhere that we work as well, in that someone has a dashboard with performance targets and the number of jobs completed by cable workers, and whoever maintains that dashboard or whoever maintains that data source probably doesn't have some kind of calculation that offsets toilet breaks.
Or neutralizes for it.
I think one of the most interesting things that I've seen or heard you do with that class you run is swapping medical data with sales data. It's the exact same numbers across a small teleview created. Do you talk a bit more about that? Because I think that's a really interesting test that you do in that must encourage.
Yeah, that's a really fun one. I really enjoy doing that one. It's we use Alteryx to build a predictive model, and it's this is relatively early in the DS training, and what I've got is a load of sales data. So I have this setup where I say that we're a manufacturer and we've developed 30 new products. We have enough budget to launch 5 products. So we take the historical data, and there's various columns in there about cost of development and binary fields suitable for children, yes, no, that kind of thing. What we want to do is create a model to predict product success for the new data. So we look at the historical products that have worked well and haven't worked well, and we take the new products, use the same kind of columns to work to just give like a logistic regression to see whether it's going to succeed or not. Based on this data, which 5 products should we pick to launch? So people happily open this, develop their predictive models, and find the 5 new products that are most likely to be successful products according to based on their development. All right.
Yeah.
So then the next question is, we're a hospital. There's a list of patients who are waiting for an expensive operation, which has no guarantee of working. We have 30 patients on the list, and we only have enough budget for 5 operations. Take the historical patient data, and it's this time it feels like patient's age and patient's income, because income is like one of the best correlates for health outcomes there is, and a binary field for smoker, yes or no, that kind of thing. And then the question is, which 5 patients do have the greatest chance of success? Which 5 patients should we operate on because they're most likely to for it to work? And some people are outraged, some people dive straight in, and then a little later people realize, hang on, this is the exact same data set. You've just changed the column headers.
Yeah.
And yes, that's the exact thing, right? But the context of the data is identical. The only thing that's changed is the context of what you're doing with it.
Mm-hmm. And one has more gravitas than the other, right? It kind of hits home. The second, the hospital one, hits home a little bit harder.
Yeah.
Because you start asking yourself actual ethical questions about, well, what ethical framework am I actually going to use to make this decision? Should it be the same one you'd use for, in sort of objects, or should you use a more sort of sound set of principles to choose who you treat and who you don't treat that are not based on values that are in the data, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is also where it gets very difficult and fuzzy, because there just isn't a right answer to that. The fun side, but also the difficult side, is exploring with people how to approach these questions when there just isn't a right answer. There is a right answer from a technical perspective, and how to do the regression, but there is not a right answer in terms of the ethical perspective and the outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think going a bit deeper into that this is where you get into, like, for example, big banks have the security and privacy regulations and security settings they have. For example, you can't go down to such a level of granularity. So the responsibility then becomes on the individual, not only just to be aware of the context, but also the context of the data they're using. So, for example, if you're able to, so I'm in Chelmsford right now, but you could probably find out where I am exactly by tweaking certain filters. If you're working for, I don't know, the my internet service provider, you can find out where I am and who I am based on your innate knowledge, right? But this is where it's responsible for the person creating the data to almost have those security settings in place. So you can't go down to a single row. You can't use, once you get to 100 rows of data, everything gets obfuscated.
Obfuscated.
Everything gets obfuscated. There you go. What Gwilym said. Obfuscated. That or MD5 hash or something like that. And that's really important. And alongside that, because I think your example, Gwilym, of the sort of the predictive model really comes into what's happening and the sort of future trends people are expecting. We've talked about Moore's law on this podcast before, where computing is getting cheaper and automation is coming effectively. But through automation, you also get bias, like the inherent bias we have. So, for example, if we ever get to a point where the legal system is run by some level of AI, it will be inherently biased because, there is a tarnished history in the legal system about biases that people have within themselves that then come out during trials and all these high pressure situations because humans make mistakes. And trying to do something at that level and scale and volume is tricky. So where AI starts to have bias because it's not trained in a certain way also comes into this, right?
Yeah, and people will often say with some reason that this isn't biased. This is done by a machine. The machine is blind to human prejudice. No, the machine is only as good as the input data that you give it, and the training data for a model is always going to come from human decisions and human behaviors and human processes, which are, we are generally awful to each other. So the machine is just going to learn that and learn how to recreate that quite effectively.
And even if you take that down to really granular level, like sort of computer logic, like if statements and nested logic, like that's got a very limited sort of set of frameworks, right? There's only so far you can take that sort of framework as a programmer and build an algorithm, because it's still using the fundamental building blocks of logic gates to do the yes and no stuff. So even that in itself is like an ethical limitation. AI can only function as well as the technology that sits underneath it, and that unfortunately is still quite basic at its core.
I think we're definitely into the so what. We're really into the discussion about data ethics and data security. So I think, go on.
So one of the things I sort of struggle with is being a consultant and this friction against this topic around ethics, because actually as a consultant, what you're trying to do as a consultant is help your client do the job better, do whatever they've got you in to do in a better way, in a more reliable way. And sometimes you come up against this friction where the client wants X, but actually you think Y is slightly better for them. And adding data ethics to that mix is something that I've never really understood. Like, what's the best way to convince your client that data ethics is something they should consider? Because often you're there because they haven't actually thought about some of these, never mind analytical concepts in detail. What about sort of ethical concepts in detail? And so I wonder, how do you guys think that discussion or friction point is best sort of breached, as it were?
So it's people will just want you to do the job that you are hired to do. And if you start talking about something else, people are going to react generally negatively, in a way that if I have something wrong with my flat and I call out the electrician or the plumber, I want them to sort out the electricity and I want them to sort out the plumbing. I'm not necessarily interested in them providing a completely different service to me, even
or
if
like,
that service.
Here's how you should change your bank account, or telling you about how you should invest in the blockchain.
Yeah, and maybe they'd be totally right about changing my bank account, but the point is that wasn't the context where I wanted to hear it, so it's going to fall on deaf ears. So I try to, anytime that I'm with a client and I think that something's a bit of a data ethics issue, I try and frame it more as, let's think about the way that this is working, but also, have you considered that doing this in this way will have these unintended consequences for the data or for your profit line or whatever. One situation where I had that was working with a very simple sales performance dashboard, and they wanted to assess their salespeople, and the metric that they were using for assessing their salespeople was basically just the amount of minutes spent on the phone per day, and from a business perspective, that's like, what you're going to do, chain your sales reps to a desk and a phone. That's not actually getting the job done very well. So I was able to frame it as a question of, okay, can we link particular salespeople to revenue and then do some kind of comparison where basically like a ratio of revenue earned per minute spent on phone, and I was able to persuade them that was a better metric, just in terms of, this is going to reward your salespeople that are more effective. But from a data ethics standpoint, I didn't even mention data ethics to them, but I'm sitting there thinking, you're poor salespeople. All you're doing is just making them do call after call after call after call, because what you're rewarding is persistence, not flexibility. Right. And it's, from the ethics perspective, the way that you're monitoring them and measuring them just makes their job atrocious.
Right.
So,
and it encourages bad behavior.
Yeah. And that was a nice one where the ethics side aligned with the responsible metric side, the ethics side aligned with just a generally better metric side for the business. So that was nice.
Yeah, for sure. I think what's really, I think your example of climate change really helps here, right? Like, for example, you can tell someone you should recycle that, but you're not going to be like, it's one of these things you'll mention it because it's something you care about. It's not like, there's probably recycling consultants out there that tell you like all these different things you can do to be more green. But effectively, it's sort of like that, right? You just do your bit, you say your piece, and then leave it there. You don't really force someone to donate some money to offset their carbon emissions and things like this, right? You don't sit there and like, no, you have to do this. You really should. It's like, well, okay, cool, I will, but don't make me do that, that sort of thing. But so I think your advice point is definitely how you deal with that sort of thing, because and you really have to play these things by the ear. I don't think there's a hard and fast way of forcing an implementation of data ethics, but just having the conversation, talking about it, is a start.
So the Open Data Institute have a really nice data ethics framework for developing new projects. And again, I think that's a great starting point, but it also depends on the amount of buy-in that people have. So while the framework is fantastic for people who are engaged and willing to look at developing a new project under with particular ethical guidelines, or when looking at investigating different ethical approaches to the project that they're doing, if you try to do the same thing with people who are already disengaged, it's I don't know, you'd have to be a much more convincing person than I am to be able to make that a success.
Yeah, you're fighting an uphill sort of battle at that point. Yeah.
Cool. I think we're in the now what section now. So we're sort of talking about, we've talked about data ethics, what it is. We've spoken a bit more about how it's used, why it's important, all these different things. And we're almost at like well, what should we be doing? Like, what should we do next? And almost like, how will this we're in a new decade, we're in 2020, like, how will this impact the future versus where it is today? And how can we, as a community of people, of tech workers and data workers and people that have this access and responsibility, how do we actively take this forward? Tim, do you want to start on this one?
Yeah, I think the way I normally do this kind of thing is that I tend to look at what other people have done, so shamelessly copy essentially. So there's a couple of data ethics frameworks, and it's interesting because the data ethics means something different to every organization. And so actually getting a feel for what different companies think ethics refers to is probably a really good start, because you might have a different sort of understanding of that in the context of the business that you run. For example, if you're a hospital, well, that has to be paramount. Whereas, I don't know, if you're a stock trader, just take an extreme example. Well, your ethical framework might need to be a bit more robust. But my point is that the things you have to worry about immediately in front of you are slightly different. And so I think that's the first thing I'd normally do. I don't know what you guys think. Well, what do you think are some of the key steps people should take?
What I like doing is just talking about data ethics with a sense of enthusiasm, because I find that a lot of people know that data ethics is a thing that people talk about, but haven't necessarily read things about it or haven't necessarily really dived into it, because the way that data ethics is presented can sometimes feel quite prescriptive and forbidding and like a list of rules. But what's really nice is that just talking enthusiastically about books like Invisible Women or Weapons of Mass Destruction, people suddenly get interested in and think, okay, well, it's not just like a set of commandments that you have to follow. It's a constant evolving living thing that you can think about and identify, and it affects everything more than you think. And just talking about it with enthusiasm, I find it helps just encourage people to get interested, because it's a whole new area of conceptually interesting things to discover and read about and learn more about. So I find that helps a lot.
One of the things that I found, and I echo that completely, because one of the things I definitely struggled with was the sort of everyday sectorism side of things. And through people talking to me about it and sort of almost showing the biases and showing the things I should be thinking about when I'm speaking, and the things you do unconsciously just because society and the culture and things around you have just shaped you to be, even though it could be right or wrong. I think data ethics sort of sits where, in a similar sort of vein, where you want to be talking about something that's quite important and making people think about it, just doing it actively, but not like annoyingly. So talking about it in a way, as you say, Gwilym, with enthusiasm, showing interesting examples, and sort of elevating the role data security, data ethics, and data privacy play in our everyday life as we become, there's more and more data being used by companies, but also we have a responsibility for our own data and also the data we work in, especially being workers in this industry. I think that definitely will start just bringing it into the conversation more, right? Just bringing it into the discourse, and the things we talk about, things we think about, automatically by virtue will improve or try to improve or at least shape the actions we take.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's actually also, Gwilym's point about enthusiasm is actually probably the most pertinent thing there. I think we have this habit, especially of bringing up sort of topics in consulting in a very dry way. And it really helps actually if you approach a topic with enthusiasm. But also, I think from an individual perspective, just thinking, well, how do you do that in an enthusiastic way? Because every client is different, but also the context is different. Your audience is different. Factoring it into sort of your champions. When you go talking to your champions and people who you're going to bring on as stewards for your data literacy projects, how do you factor that into the way they approach people? It's about cultivating a culture, as it were, of where that topic, data ethics, is more sort of frequently discussed and considered. Because only by doing that do you then have everyone in the organization thinking about it. If one person thinks about it, it's probably not going to be very ethical in itself, right? So
it's also going to be very biased.
Yeah,
to that person's perspective on the world, right?
Yeah, or lack perspectives,
right,
if it's not sort of from a broad group of people. So
yeah,
I think it's a very important sort of thing to consider. Okay.
One final thing that I think doesn't get raised as data ethics that often is going back to the technical side of things. So I completely mangle a join on an almost daily basis. I join on the wrong fields, right, or I do a left join instead of an inner join where it should be the other way around. But the point is that I normally catch these mistakes and rectify them before any kind of negative effects in the later data pipeline happen. But the the thing is that in my head, this is mostly just, oops, messed up a join again, better correct it. But just small technical things can have a huge effect on as well. And just small technical things can have a huge effect as well. And I think that the outcomes from small technical effects could be classified as data ethics. So, for example, if you're doing a join of hundreds of thousands of personal records, and let's say that you've got you're joining two tables of people's names, and you're joining on the name instead of someone's consistent personal ID. Spelling mistakes happen. People's names will be spelled differently in different tables. If you are joining on people's names, and because of spelling mistakes, some people fall out of that join, what business process are you doing which means that people are now missing from your data but shouldn't be? So, for example, you could have, if you're looking up, say, people's addresses and whether or not they've paid their TV license, but you've joined on someone's name which has a spelling mistake in it, or is spelled inconsistently, or someone's changed their name since they paid their TV license, that kind of thing. If you're taking the left output of that join and saying, okay, the people who are in the addresses table and are not in the have made a payment table, we're going to go after them. You get the situation where people are being hassled for payment, which they've already made. And this is affecting people's lives in a very negative way. People feel hassled, people feel stressed. And all it is because someone's joined on a name instead of a person ID. You know, and so I think that one of the most, in terms of making small steps towards data ethics, one of the best things you can do is set up as many kind of checkpoints as possible throughout your data pipeline to try and predict where you're going to go wrong and try and rectify any mistakes that you might make. And I think of this as competence ethics, in that one of the most ethical things you can do, I think, is be good at your job.
Yeah.
Just to minimize as many mistakes and the horrific effects of unintended mistakes.
Yeah, just do your job, basically.
And I don't,
it just reminds me of that.
Yeah, I don't want that to turn into feeling like I'm hassling people or making people feel bad, because that's not the effect I want. It's just about admitting that you're human and you're going to make, even the best technical architects are going to make mistakes in their data pipeline at some point. And just to spend your day with the idea in the back of your mind that, hey, at some point I might mess up. What would the effect of that be? And how can I make sure I don't mess up?
Yeah. And this comes back to like things like systems, right? And having like the checklist of stuff you need to do before you make something productionized, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where process and systems and protocols that people put in place. And if you design those with data ethics in mind alongside everything else you have to consider, then yeah, absolutely, you start minimizing those mistakes, right?
It's a very valid point. I actually think people should take solace from that, because I think we all do pride ourselves in the quality of the work we all do. So at the very least, if you keep on sort of aspiring to do your job better, then inherently you'll eventually get there, if that makes sense. You'll eventually get to the point where ethics is something that is considered, but there has to be that concerted effort to just think about it a little bit more as well, to kind of take it into your thought process. Okay, I think that's it. That's been a great episode, Gwilym. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being our first guest.
You didn't tell me I was going to be the first guest. So I felt
dare I say it?
Very flattered.
But yeah. Absolutely. No, it's been an absolute pleasure. I think it's been great. Ravi and I know nothing about data ethics, so we when we thought of this topic, we just thought, well, there's one guy, and that was you. So
I think
got right.
If there's any takeaway, like there are very, very few experts. I've read a bit. There's always so much more to learn and so much more to explore. Right. I'd never want to call myself an expert on data ethics. I just really like reading about it and learning and trying to incorporate it into my job.
Exactly. Cool. If you want to listen to old episodes of the podcast, head to datanpodcast.com. You can find all the links to subscribe in your favorite podcast reader. If you want to join the conversation, Twitter handle is exactly the same, Datum Podcast. Give us a tweet. We're going to be talking about the episode a lot, I'm sure, in the future as data ethics becomes more pertinent. And join us for the next episode, which will be in a couple of weeks. Farewell.
Cool. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Cheers.